grew up on a farm in North Wales, and growing up in a very traditional, loving family meant that my brothers always got to go out and do the farming, and my sister and I had to always stay indoors and do the cooking. I was never any good at cooking, so I decided to leave Wales and move down to London to follow my mum's career choice to become a children's nurse. And becoming a children's nurse was by far the best professional and indeed personal decision that I've ever done. But I guess that overwhelming desire to roll around in the mud prevailed, and I began to play rugby. Being a woman, you were always told to play nicely, get along with people, and that's quite difficult sometimes to express your competitive side. And playing rugby allowed me to express my competitive side in a really healthy, team-spirited sort of way, with the additional value that even if I didn't look like an athlete, just by applying a little bit of deep heat, I could at least smell like an athlete. I was selected for the Welsh senior squad and absolutely loved everything about my rugby playing days and combining it with my children's nursing career. But unfortunately, I was dropped from the Welsh squad, having only got 13 A caps and never actually having that full cap. And it also coincided with me going through a divorce. So I was in a pretty dark and miserable place. I couldn't afford therapy, so instead I decided to cross the Atlantic Ocean. Most people fly it, some take a cruise ship, some sail it, but I decided that I would row across it. I'd never rowed before, I'd never been to sea before, and I certainly didn't have the £63,000 that it would take to fund the campaign. But when they say never underestimate a woman on a mission, this was particularly true for me at this time. And the first thing I did was to find somebody that was brave enough or crazy enough to come and join this adventure with me. And I looked towards my colleagues and persuaded her Dipsidou, another children's nurse at Great Ormond Street Hospital, to join me for the adventure. We launched Nautical Nurses campaign, and 2 years later, we found ourselves in a 24-foot marine plywood boat about to head off to sea from the Canaries. Very quickly, we realized that rowing for 12 hours a day is very, very painful, particularly on your backside. And sitting on this very hard and uncomfortable seat for that amount of time meant that I've got that shape imprinted on my bottom forevermore. The other very painful thing about rowing out on the open waves is that every rogue wave that throws the boat up means that you land the boat back at a funny angle, and all the weight of the boat then transfers through the oars and smashes onto your shin. And inevitably, in a 2-hour shift, that oar would smack the exact same point every single time, bringing tears into my eyes on more occasions than I could care to remember. But actually, the physical part of it was not the difficult part. It was the emotional, psychological part of it, and that was compounded by the sleep deprivation. I would row for 2 hours, rest for 2 hours, row for 2 hours, and rest for 2 hours. But in our 2 hours off, we didn't really get 2 hours worth of sleep. This was our cabin, and as you can see, we couldn't stand up in it, we couldn't sit up in it. It was barely bigger than a coffin. And as a result, sleep deprivation very quickly kicked in, and the hallucination that comes with sleep deprivation also followed, which means that I saw absolutely everything out there on the ocean. We made it to Christmas Day, and it was by far the most surreal Christmas that I'd ever experienced. Father Christmas didn't find us out on there on the waves, but we did get to share a Marks and Spencer's Christmas cake, which was quite a special experience. As the days went into weeks, I realized that I loved life on the ocean. I loved the sunsets, the sunrises, the rainbows, and everything about it. And lots of people asked me since, were you not lonely out there? And it really made me realize the difference between being alone and being lonely, and how you can actually be surrounded by people and feel more lonely than you've ever done when you're alone. And there's chocolate. Out there on the ocean, I could eat as many as 4 chocolate bars a day and never feel guilty about it. Every Sunday, I'd jump off the boat to clean the bottom of the hull. Because we were rowing so slowly, the barnacles would grow, and by scraping them off, it meant that we didn't have any drag. And as I scraped them, the little fish would follow and eat them. The big fish would follow, and then The theme tune of Jaws would echo in the back of my mind, and I'd quickly jump back on board. Dolphins would come and visit at a time that we always thought we can't do this. And he genuinely felt that the dolphins had been sent by friends and family to cheer us up along the way, which was just amazing to see them. I do have a confession about this photo, though, that while I did take it, I actually took it off the coast of Wales on my return, which just shows you can go looking for something all around the world and find it on your doorstep. The visitors that we didn't like to see were the cargo ships, because these travel so fast that from the point of seeing them on the horizon to the potential risk of a collision means that it's a very scary thing. And even when you VHF radio them to ask them to divert their course, they go, "Oh no, don't worry, we can't see you, it's fine." It's like, it's because you can't see us, it's a problem. As the days rolled into the weeks and the weeks rolled into months, we realized that the journey was going to take far longer than we expected. And sadly, everything on the boat, including ourselves, was starting to fall apart, which meant that we had to rely on duct tape to fix it all. And finally, we saw Antigua, which should have meant that we could have rowed in. But my parents hadn't arrived yet, so we drifted around for 2 days to give them the chance to arrive. And then we rowed in so quickly, forgot to stop rowing, and crashed very loudly against the harbour wall, convincing everybody that we were quite useless at the end of the journey as we had been at the beginning. It certainly hadn't been the straight line journey that we'd hoped for. It had taken 77 days, 7 hours, and 37 minutes. But for me, the success of the campaign was not that we had rowed across the Atlantic Ocean. The success of the campaign was that we had raised £190,000 for metabolic research at Great Ormond Street Hospital. And that money had funded for Dr. Emma Footage to spend 3 years studying the value of vitamin B6 to manage a very rare orphan disease, which can be managed with the simple supplement of vitamin B6. And been then able to work with Emma to get that recognised as an orphan designation at the European Medicine Agency really, for me, crystallised what the success of that campaign had been. On a personal level, it also meant that I now had found my newfound love for the ocean. I went on to row across the Indian Ocean, becoming part of the first all-female crew to ever row across the Indian Ocean, and also raising money for breast cancer care. I then went on to sail across the Pacific, which was an amazing experience, given that I'd never sailed before. And December just gone, I also got to sail two-handed across the Atlantic, which just really blew my mind away, how all of a sudden what turned out to be a little self-searching journey has now meant I've genuinely found my passion. On a professional level, it gave me the confidence to believe that with hard work, I could really achieve anything. And having been a bit of a delinquent at school, I was thrilled that I was then able to graduate with a PhD from UCL, which I'm sure my school teachers don't quite believe still. My background was as a nurse, and through my career, I went on to specialise looking after children with very rare disorders that were being recruited into clinical trials. And these were the children and their families' only hope when they were facing the diagnosis of a very devastating disease. But with these clinical trials, there always came the sort of clause that a child must be able to swallow a tablet, a child must be able to comply with tests. And anybody that's ever worked or has children knows that that's not what children do. And that's what I experienced with Mia. Mia is the young girl that I'd looked after for years and years and years. And every time she and her parents would come, I would have to encourage them. And when I say encourage, I probably enforce them to take on these horrible tests. And then at the end of every test, Mia's mum would say thank you to Elin. And I just couldn't understand why a little girl would say, "Thank you for sticking needles in me today, Elin." And whenever I looked at these clinical trials, I was convinced that there had to be a different way of doing things so that we could get really meaningful data about how the children's diseases are doing and how they're responding to therapy. And this is the type of test that Mia and other children like Mia had to undergo, which was just impossible for them to comply with, which, needless to say, that lots of the trials that we do end up with inconclusive results. And my PhD was based on that. Let's find an easy way, a way that doesn't hurt, a way that's not invasive to try and able to assess these children. And that was the foundation of Aparito, a tech startup that I've developed on from my PhD. Because Mia has one rare disease, but there's actually 6,000 to 8,000 other diseases too, affecting 3.5 million here in the UK, and 50% of them are children. So we need to change the way that we're assessing children with a very sterile snapshot assessment at home. And we need to make the most of the way that technology has evolved to give us a very good understanding of how life is for them every day, at home, at school, with their friends and with their family. And that's where technology today is amazing. We can use wearable technology, which uses passive remote monitoring, smartphone apps, and web apps to mean that we get a complete understanding of their health and well-being. And that's where I hope Aparito can build the wealth of knowledge about these rare diseases. On a personal level, I reflect back to where I was 8 years ago in those dark and depressing days, having been dropped from the Welsh rugby squad and going through a divorce. And I can't quite believe how my life's changed around, from being able to publish my books, to carry the Olympic torch, to even having an invitation to meet the Queen at Buckingham Palace. But for me, the most important thing has been the amount of money that I've been able to raise for charity, and also the opportunity to raise awareness for rare diseases that otherwise would not have happened. And this is really all down to two very special people, Henry and Mia. They're two out of numerous patients that I've looked after over the years. But when I landed back in Gatwick Airport after my row across the Atlantic, these two people were there to welcome me in. And it was those two and their parents, Lucy and Joe, that had really believed that our row across the Atlantic was possible, and had gone out of their way to help secure the sponsorship and the necessary things that could make it possible. And I couldn't believe that in the day-to-day challenges that they had to face as a family, that they'd gone out of their way to support our dream to row across the Atlantic. And so they will continue to be my inspiration. Thank you.